Well, thank you everybody for coming today. We're going to be talking about anxiety in teens, but I have to acknowledge the fact that the tips we're going to talk about today are going to be very relevant for younger kids as well as adults. So you'll hear the examples I give are kind of tailored to teens, but recognize if you have younger children or, just anxiety within yourself, these are things you can try. I'm going to talk really briefly about this slide here because I mentioned it last time. So I'm Dr. Tara Egan, and I own a therapy practice called Charlotte Parent Coaching. And I'm the host of a parenting podcast called One Day You'll Thank Me. And my specialty areas are working with families who need some support in managing technology and social media for their teens, helping families navigate through separation and divorce, and then also managing anxiety in children and teens. And anxiety is a huge issue with, honestly, people of all ages, but particularly during this time of COVID, because so many of us are adjusting to changes in our environment, and our world is a little bit upside down, whether it's financial, whether it's how our kids are being, schooled, whether it's our social life is impacted. So it's a really relevant topic to talk about. All right, so let's talk about, I'm just going to give you a preview. We're going to talk about managing anxiety in your teen, and we're going to touch upon these three concepts of validating, allocating time, and gratitude or positive thinking. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of those things as we go along. So first of all, I want to identify and define anxiety, because it can be an emotion that we sometimes mistake for, like, we replace the feeling, or we put that word in when we're trying to talk about like anticipation or even excitement. So if you're a person who struggles with anxiety and then you start to feel that butterflies in your stomach or excitement or anticipation, like, a lot of times we can take a positive situation and shift our mindset to define it or label it within ourselves as being anxiety, which immediately puts a negative connotation onto most things. So anxiety is an emotion characterized by an unpleasant state of inner turmoil, dread, fear, uneasiness, or worry. And oftentimes we can feel it internally, but there's can be physical symptoms that we see. So shaking, pacing around, that restless feeling, getting sweaty, having our breath come very labored, feeling a headache or stomach pain, having really tense muscles, and that can go along with that headache is where our body is just used to be feeling really tense. Sometimes people who are anxious experience trouble sleeping, and then they can feel worn out really easily. So that fatigue feeling can come from, one, not sleeping well or having that muscle tension, but also it's really exhausting to be having a lot of anxious thoughts. So people will report feeling very worn out or worn down. And then also we know that anxiety impacts concentration and can also make kids and adults more clingy. So we hear with little kids, we'll hear parents say that they have separation anxiety, which is a totally normal developmental stage. But there's some parents who will talk about their middle schoolers or their high schoolers or even college students demonstrating clinginess, where maybe they're calling all the time, or they're reluctant to separate from a parent, a loved one, a significant other. So that's just another sign that your child can be experiencing anxiety. So, and what happens when people experience anxiety is they tend to make their world smaller. They tend to avoid stressful circumstance. They tend to feel like they can't do something, like their sense of competence is diminished. And then they oftentimes make assumptions that whatever it is they're confronted with is going to be a negative interaction or a negative experience. So we see that people with anxiety really struggle with keeping their world big, trying new things, feeling competent. And with anxiety, it could be really short-lived. It could be, I feel really anxious about going to the dentist, or I'm really struggling to go on this hike because it's really high up and I'm feeling anxious because I have a fear of heights. Or it can be something chronic. And when anxiety is chronic, sometimes we assume that this is sort of part of someone's personality. Like, well, they're just naturally high strung. They're just, type A. They're just a perfectionist and things like that. And yeah, absolutely, people can have a more perfectionistic personality. But if it tips from having like attention to detail to being always in a state of turmoil or agitation or irritability, because oftentimes when individuals have anxiety, they appear very irritable and short-tempered. If that's sort of a chronic state for yourself or your child, then that's a strong indicator that anxiety is playing a role. All right, so what do we do? What do we do once we identify that our teen is struggling with anxiety? So the first thing I want to talk about is validating your feelings. And validation is when you recognize and you accept another person's thoughts or feelings or experiences. And you recognize that it's something understandable. Like, you can understand that they're feeling this way. Now, validating someone's feelings doesn't mean that you agree with them or that you approve of their thinking or their choices, but it does suggest that you're being present with that individual and sort of in a space where you're really listening and absorbing and trying to have like a compassionate outlook for the fact that this person is feeling anxious. Okay, so I'm going to slide it to the next slide here and talk about some behavior and phrasing that demonstrates validation, and then a couple examples of phrasing and behavior that does not demonstrate validation. So if you're demonstrating validation, you're being present, you're listening. So this is maybe you're making eye contact, you're sitting close enough to demonstrate that you're interested and invested in the conversation, maybe setting down your phone or, stop washing the dishes or whatever you're doing so that they feel attended to. You can oftentimes show validation by reflecting someone's feelings. So I hear that you're feeling worried about this. So I hear that you're feeling discouraged. You seem really stressed. It sounds like this is really frustrating for you. And oftentimes people who are feeling anxiety, when they have that emotion recognized and repeated back to them, that alone can do a lot in making them feel, like joined in by another person, to make them feel connected and understood. Another phrasing is, I understand what you're saying, or what you're saying makes sense to me, or I hear that. I'm so glad you told me how you feel. Those are things, and you notice in those phrasing, those examples of phrases I gave you, none of them say, I completely understand and think you're 100% justified and that your feelings and behavior are accurate and rational. Like, that's not what you're saying. You're saying that you hear them and you're present with them, and you're recognizing where they're at emotionally. Okay, so don't mistake validation for agreeing and expressing that an irrational thought is somehow rational. Things that can be very dismissive and indicate that you're not validating emotions is when you say things like, oh, you shouldn't feel that way. That's ridiculous. You're being dramatic. You're overreacting. Don't be silly. You're acting crazy. That's stupid. Those types of phrasing puts a barrier between you and the person you're speaking to, most of the time your child, and it ends up making that for a person feel really misunderstood, very isolated and alone. Maybe it even makes them feel kind of crazy or ashamed. And we don't want our children to be afraid to tell us when they're feeling anxious, because then we can never get to the point where we support them through that thought process and help them develop more healthy thinking. So, recognize that even if it's an emotion that doesn't make sense to you, it's still an emotion that they're really feeling. And the fact that they shared it with you is really a privilege. And so it's important that you take that information and acknowledge that's where they're at. So hopefully you can get to a space and have a connection with them where you can help them shift their thinking so they don't have so many anxious thoughts, because it does drive their behavior. All right. So the next thing I want to tell you about a little bit is allocating time. So sometimes parents can have this impulse to take away their kids' worry. Like, we just need to have them become a person that doesn't worry about things. First of all, a certain amount of anxiety is really functional. A certain amount of anxiety keeps us safe and tuned into our environment. So when I walk into a parking lot, I need to have a certain amount of anxiety to make sure that I stay attentive. I need to be mindful of the traffic that's going by. I need to be mindful of if there's any strangers who are in my path, or if there's something unsafe in the parking lot. I need to be attending to not losing my keys or my purse, and making sure that I remember to get all my groceries out of the cart. So having a certain amount of attentiveness and awareness of your circumstances is really important. We want kids to feel just enough anxiety to go ahead and study for that math test. We want them to feel just enough anxiety to remember to use respectful language around elders, or to be tuned in to a friend's emotions. So having anxiety is functional as long as it stays in that range of sort of normal, healthy, productive anxiety. Okay, so your child's going to worry, and that's okay. But when our child shows some excessive worry, where it's impacting their ability to be functional and engage in activities that are new or exciting, or could cause a little bit of hesitation, then it can make their world really small. And so in that circumstance, telling your kids, well, you just can't worry. You've got to try new things. How you're acting is irrational or silly. What can be more helpful is just putting a boundary around it, where there's space in their day for you to sit down and have a conversation with them, or maybe they have some time writing a journal entry where they can kind of let those thoughts percolate and they can express them. But it's not something that's going on all day and just sort of untethered and free floating and just catapulting down a hill where it gets worse and worse and worse. We don't want kids to what we call ruminate. And ruminating is when they really start thinking over and over, almost obsessively, about a negative thought. And it just wears them down. And it pushes them towards acting in a way that's really avoidant or even fearful. So we want to set some time aside. And with younger kids, oftentimes it's like, it's not right at bedtime. It's not right when it's time for them to go to sleep, because we don't want to dredge up all these negative feelings. But it might be after dinner, where we ask them how their day is, and we reflect back on their emotions, like, oh, it sounds like that was really frustrating for you. Or, how did that make you feel? You seem upset. I see you're crying, or whatever it is. And then we can be in the process of helping them reframe their emotions. Let me go ahead here. So we've set aside some time for kids to worry, or have that time to just really be reflective of their emotions. And then what we want to do is set the stage to sort of coach them into moving beyond that. Okay, so I want to show you this diagram. If you were part of the presentation last week, this same diagram was mentioned. And so you're going to see this again and again, because it is so helpful when it comes to understanding how we think. So in this triangle, you'll see at the top, it says thoughts. Okay, so this is what we think. So for kids who have anxious thoughts, this is where it starts. They'll say, instead of saying like, oh, I don't know if I studied enough for my math test, they're like, I'm definitely going to fail my math test, and I'm probably not going to get into college. Like, it's very extreme. And so it might start off with a rational thought, which is, oh, I don't know that I studied hard enough for my math test. If they know that they wasted time yesterday, or didn't do the sample problems, or didn't ask questions during class, it could be a very rational thought to think that they might not be completely prepared for their math test. But then when those thoughts become untethered, and it's just like this free-flowing process where they go kind of really dark with it, or really extreme, then that's when the anxiety is, getting out of that normal zone and getting more extreme. So like I said, I'm going to fail the test. I'm going to fail the quarter. I'm going to have a big fat D on my transcript, and I'm not going to get into college. Like, that's not really productive because it can cause kids to sort of give up or feel very despairing. So when we recognize that kids are prone to having really negative thoughts, it's important to recognize that what follows immediately after that tends to be really negative emotions. So the example I give kids, and when I work with kids, is I'll tell them, okay, let's pretend that you're sitting in your living room with your parents and you're watching TV, everybody's comfy on the couch, having a good time, and you hear a noise outside. So what's your first thought? What's your first thought about what that noise can be? And I'll oftentimes, when I ask kids that question, the kids who are more anxiety prone or fearful, they will say things like, it's somebody breaking into the house. It's a monster. It's a hurricane that's going to knock down the house. Like, their immediate go-to thinking is something that's sort of catastrophic. Okay. So then they have a thought that somebody's breaking into the house. And so you say, well, how would you feel? If that was the source of the noise, how would you feel? I would feel frightened. I would feel panicked. I would be worried that my family was going to die because they're going to get killed. And then, of course, you say, well, how would you behave? What would your body be doing if you thought someone was breaking into the house and you thought you were about to die? Well, I would call the police. I would go and hide. I would see if I could find a gun. Like, their behavior would be so extreme. Could you imagine sitting on your couch, watching a movie with your family, and you hear a noise? And what comes from that as you go through this triangle process is to actually call the police and go get a gun. And this is assuming, your family lives in a normal, safe neighborhood, and there's no reason to think that that's happening. Okay, I do want to, acknowledge that. So when I work with kids and I ask that same question, okay, you're watching TV, you hear a noise outside, what could it be? Sometimes kids will say something really neutral. They'll say, it might be the neighbor's dog on our back patio, or it could be the wind blowing, or maybe it's, my brother's sitting out there reading his book, or whatever it is. They'll come up with something that's really, really neutral. It's not anything to be stressed about. And then I say, okay, so how would you feel if you thought it was the neighbor's dog out there? What would you feel? Oh, it would be no big deal. The neighbor's dog comes over all the time and he always goes home. What behavior would you show? I would just be sitting on the couch and I would keep watching TV. And that's it. So your body's calm. You're not having catastrophic thinking. So think about those two scenarios. In one scenario, the kids panic for their life. And in another scenario, they think it's the neighbor's dog and it's just not a big deal. And what about those things are different? Like, nothing. It's the same scenario. There's a little noise outside. So oftentimes when I do that exercise with kids, it gives me an idea of what they gravitate to in their thinking pattern. Okay. So if we have a kid who immediately goes to such negative thinking, our goal, of course, is to always teach them, let's stop that negative thinking at the beginning and help shift that process, that triangular process, into something more productive. So identifying the extreme thought, having them understand that when you thought that because you weren't all the way prepared for your math test that you were going to fail math, have a horrible transcript, and not get into college. Okay, so that's your worst case scenario. And I ask that to kids a lot. Like, what's your worst case scenario here? Well, then I'm not going to get into college. That's the worst case scenario. Okay, so now let's talk about something that's more realistic. If you're not completely studied for your test, do you think you'll fail the test, or do you think you just won't earn the A that you're used to earning? Well, I might get a low B or I might get a C. Okay, so if you get a low C or a low B or a C on this test, does that mean your whole semester is a big failure and you're going to end up with a D in the class? No, it just means that on the next test, I'm going to have to do better. That's right. So, and I really encourage kids to use imagery when it comes to sort of throwing out that bad thought and replacing it with something productive. Because we don't want to just take a series of negative thoughts and then kind of set this like little positive thought and just kind of hope that it simmers and it works. Sometimes with kids, you can really have them imagine taking that scary thought and putting it someplace. So I had a situation a couple years ago where I was going through something really stressful involving my divorce. And I called my best friend and I said, I'm really getting very nervous about this. Lawyers make me nervous. I feel like I'm feeling very shaky. And so she had me imagine taking my worries, we kind of named what those specific worries were. And she had me imagine putting them in a backpack. And I actually imagined the thoughts and the words put in little boxes and then setting it into the backpack. And then she had me throw it off the cliff. And, we did that with each negative thought. This is me driving and her helping me process through this, and not get to a place where I was really fearful. And she had me throw that backpack off the cliff. And this is all done with imagery. And so by the time we threw away each of the fears that I had, my body was much calmer because I felt like I was throwing all those negative things off the cliff. And then I packed a new backpack that was filled with more positive thinking. Like, I'm smart. I'm a good parent. I have a good lawyer. This is just going to be one day and then it's going to be done. And, things like that were more productive and they were realistic. We don't want to ask kids to lie to themselves. They're not Einstein going into their math test, but they are a smart, capable person who has a history of doing well in math class. There's really no reason to think that this one test is going to be so different for them. And then making sure that they have appropriate words to tell their brain. Like I tell kids, create a sentence. It might be one sentence, it might be 2 or 3. Some sort of productive but accurate words to tell your brain. And you'll see elementary school teachers do this. They'll say, kiss your brain, and the kids will pat their head. Or with athletes, we'll talk about I've got this. I'm a star pitcher. I can do this. I'm strong. You know what I mean? And they'll say things that are really self-affirming, not lies, but things that make them feel powerful, in control, recognizing a more positive thought pattern is going to put them into the mindset of going into a anxiety-provoking circumstance and being able to feel and be competent in it. And then the last thing I want to note, and this last thing that I noted here, we probably could do our own solitary webinar on, was having kids tap into feelings of gratefulness. So when kids are able to articulate something that's truthful but positive, and to think about the things like, I'm grateful that I go to a good school. I'm grateful that when I email my teacher, she gets back to me. I'm grateful that I am able to ask a parent for help. I'm grateful that I'm an intelligent person who really does understand math concepts, even if I didn't study as hard as I meant to. I'm grateful that I still have time in the semester to turn my grade around. I'm grateful that I'm a person who knows how to study. Things like that, for them to be able to say those positive things and tap into the aspects that they know they can be truthfully grateful for. And we know that when people express gratitude and gratefulness, that it really shifts that pattern of thinking because they recognize that they have more control over the circumstance than they felt they did. One thing with anxiety is it can very quickly make people feel like they don't have control and they're sort of the victim of the anxiety. The anxiety is leading them around versus the opposite, which is I feel anxious and what can I do to bring that anxiety back into the normal range so that my world isn't getting smaller and I can be productive. Okay, so these are some ideas. I always try to talk, around 20 minutes. It looks like I talked an extra 5 minutes today, and I apologize for that. I just want to take a minute and remind you that I really want to make sure that these sessions reflect the parenting questions that you have and are on topics that are relevant to your family. So please, if you want to talk about a specific topic, go ahead and email at drtaraegan@gmail.com if you have any questions, or you can visit our Facebook page. You can always join us live, or you can have the webinar emailed to you at a later time to watch at your convenience. And then there is a private Facebook group called Adolescents: A Parent's Guide, a support group for high school parents. So please join us there, because that has a lot of great conversation. And if there's resources that are helpful, I make sure to post them in real time. So it's just a great resource. And then the last thing I want to mention is that with my podcast, One Day You'll Thank Me, there is an episode, it's episode 4, so it's a couple months old, where I interviewed an expert named Ashley Francis. She is a therapist that's local here in the Charlotte area, and she works a lot with adults with anxiety, or teenagers older teens, to manage anxiety. So she was on an episode and she talked a lot about high performing anxiety, like individuals who are high performers and perfectionistic, and the anxiety that they frequently suffer from, and some tips and recommendations about how to support them. So, Nick, do we have any questions? It looks like we've got a couple questions here.
Yeah, we got a couple questions. Thanks, Dr. Egan, for that. Do want to remind everybody that y'all can send in your questions if y'all have any, and we're going to start off with Pete. He asked, my teen is most anxious at bedtime. What are ways I can get her to calm down so she can get more sleep?
Okay, that's a good question, because we do see that kids can really struggle with anxiety at bedtime. That's the time when their body is quiet. They don't have the distractions during the day to kind of keep them occupied. So when kids are fretting at bedtime, couple things. One, make sure that technology is sort of put to bed preferably at least an hour. But I know with teenagers, sometimes it can be hard to have them separate from their technology a full hour before it's time to sleep. So at least 30 minutes, because we know that using those screens right up to bedtime contributes to anxious feelings, because there's a lot of peer comparison, whether they're looking at social media. It just keeps their brain really awake and animated, and that can make us feel more anxious when we're not in a state of like relaxation or feeling drowsy. So that's definitely one suggestion. And then another thing is to, like I said earlier, give your teen a chance to process if there's something on her mind, so that she can get to a place where there's problem solving. So let's say she's fretting about the fact that she may have offended a friend earlier during a conversation on FaceTime, and she's worried about it. It might be where you can just kind of create a little plan of, okay, well, tomorrow when you see them at school, maybe you can say, hey, I feel like I might have said something that offended you. I just want to check in. Are you okay? Are we okay? And just give them some points of action if needed, so that they can sort of say to themselves, like, all right, I've got a plan. Let's let this go and focus on this plan tomorrow. So those are two suggestions.
Meredith has one question. I don't know, maybe we'll try this. My teen enjoys journaling and on occasion shows me her entries. They're filled with self-hating comments and negativity. How can I help her be more loving towards herself?
So this is really common. I love the idea of kids and adults journaling. I think it can be a fantastic way for them to express their emotions. And honestly, it can achieve that goal of setting aside time, right? So if you know that they're going to have an opportunity to go into their journal, maybe they spend 10 minutes or 30 minutes sort of processing an emotion, and then they close their journal and they feel a sense of closure over it, I think that can be really great. But if they keep going back to that journal, especially if they're a kid who's like rereading past entries and remembering how sad and despairing they felt when they read those entries, one of the things is, don't censor your kid. Don't tell them you can't write those comments. That's not how you're supposed to use your journal. You need to do it differently. One of the things I encourage parents to do is to add a second journal into the process. And this might be a journal that, there's a lot out there, like you can buy on Amazon or a local bookstore that has some prompts that are more positive. And it can be a journal that you encourage them, like, if you want to write those negative feelings, go for it. But maybe here's another opportunity to shift your thinking towards something more positive. So that's one thing. Another thing is there's a lot of times it's really helpful if parents create a journal like they're sharing with their child. So it might be just you take a notebook and every day or a couple times a week, you write something really affirming towards your child. You draw a funny picture, you print out a funny meme and put it in there, you write something, a sweet memory of them, or talk about how you're proud of them or that you feel good about a recent decision they made. So it might be you supporting them and role modeling how to communicate more positive things in the written form. So there's sometimes parents will stick a sticky note to their kid's door. I remember a couple of years ago for Valentine's Day, I cut out all these hearts and I wrote these like words of praise and compliments and things like everything was sincere, things that I meant. And I just taped them all over their doors. And they, all three of them left them up for like months and months and months. And so there's things you can do to just give them another platform, another version of that journal. And it's really a great opportunity for you to role model how to shift it towards something positive. But I wouldn't want you to go in there and tell them this is how you need to use your journal, because it really is their space.
Wow. Thank you. So that was for Meredith. Julie asks, my teen rejects all my suggestions when it comes to managing his anxiety. How can I get him to buy into managing his anxiety better?
So this is where having a therapist or an outside person can be really effective. Because as much as we'd like to think that our kids are going to be good listeners to us and really respect the great advice we have to offer, sometimes just because it's coming from mom and dad immediately makes them reject it. And so, and this is, I'm a therapist, and my kids have at various points in their development seen therapists, and the therapist will oftentimes say similar things to I've said, but my kids will act like it's a genius suggestion. So I recently had my son say, Mom, my counselor talked about ways that I can, I was something like not be in a bad mood or not get upset if I'm feeling criticized. And he basically tells me about how the therapist suggested imagery, which is literally something that I've worked with him on since he was 2 or 3 years old. And so I was just like, great, buddy, that's a great idea. Do you think that's something you will try? And he's like, yeah, it's a great idea. And he kind of acted like I'd never mentioned it. And I thought, okay, here's that example of our kids just tuning us out sometimes because we're just mom or just dad. So if your teen is really rejecting of the strategies you suggest, I would rather you get a therapist for them. And it might be somebody who works with them 3 or 5 sessions just to teach them some new strategies versus thinking, well, this is just our life. I tell kids when I work with them, if they're a little resistant, I'm just like, your parents don't want this to be your life. They don't want you to be a kid who spends so much energy fretting, or that you think being this anxious all the time is just normal and there's just no way around it, because that's not true. So that would be a good opportunity to have your child connect with a counselor.
Good. Okay. Now, the next question, and this is the last one that we have right here, comes from Kate. And it says, my daughter has high anxiety and is treated for it, but it's still an ongoing problem. One issue I'm having is she's very rigid. So anytime I try to reframe or anything, she just resists everything. Any suggestions for getting her to a place where she is willing to even try anything? Right now, she's just a no, no, no.
Okay. So this is a great question. Oftentimes when kids are anxious, and this goes for adults too, is it almost, to them, it feels like it's part of their personality. It can feel really inevitable. So almost like their identity is linked with being an anxious person. Like if you just took away the anxiety with a magic wand, they would feel like they weren't even themselves. So that can mean that kids and adults can really cling on to that pattern of thinking because it's what's familiar and recognizable. Because one of the scariest things for kids who are anxious is change or trying something new. So you're really asking her to do something uncomfortable when you're asking her to pretty drastically change how she confronts the world. So in that situation, you're not as much focused on the positive thinking that you want her to have, is you're focused on her willingness to use a strategy. So in that situation, if you can build in reinforcers, okay, so basically like rewards, anytime she's able to demonstrate a healthier choice when it comes to thinking. So it might be, hey, if you're willing to reframe this thought, or you're willing to try this strategy, that's what you're rewarding. Maybe it's something, super tangible, like you stop at Starbucks and get a hot chocolate. Or for real little kids, sometimes we'll put like cotton balls in a jar when they can reframe. Like they'll come and they'll say something like, they get into an argument with their little siblings and they're like, I hate little siblings. My little sibling, he's so mean to me and he hates me and he's always so, he always hits me, which anytime kids use never or always, it shows that they have some extreme thinking. So there's a little boy I work with, when he's able, and mom says, all right, let's switch that thought, because it's not true that little brother always hates you or always hits you. And so he feels motivated to put that cotton ball in a jar, because when he gets 10 cotton balls, he gets 15 extra minutes of technology time. So in that situation, we're not really saying the goal is for you to be less anxious. We're shifting the goal to be you trying a new strategy. So sometimes you just got to throw some motivation there to have them realize, like, all right, I'm going to get something from this, because oftentimes positive thinking begets positive thinking. They feel competent, they feel proud of themselves, you're able to praise them, and it's just more practice, because so much of dealing with anxiety in a healthy way is having them use the strategies enough to be practiced in them so they can default to that strategy without excessive prompting. But in the beginning, they're going to need you. They're going to need you to sort of really motivate and isolate what the strategy is. There was a young man I worked with a couple of years ago who really struggled with anxiety and negative thinking during his baseball games. And he was like a super great athlete. And so basically, he was still allowed to get upset. And so it wasn't like his parents were super focused on, were you able to bring yourself out of your funk? But if he was able to use at least two of the strategies we came up with during his games, then they would stop for ice cream on the way home. So it didn't have to be that the strategies worked perfectly, but if he was willing to kind of calm his body down, reframe the circumstance, use his mantra, we created a mantra and he had it on a bracelet. And if he was able to calmly look at it and restate it, and we had some criteria on what it meant to use the strategies. And if he did those things, even if he really didn't get to a place that was really productive, then he would get his reward of ice cream on the way home. And over time, it got easier and easier for him to do it. And then after a while, we just didn't need ice cream because things were going so much better. So hopefully that answers your question.
Well, I think we're done for the Q&A.
Okay.
Remind everybody all the resources that we have.
Yes. So make sure that you tap into, this webinar every week, and please share the link with a friend if you feel like this could be beneficial. Make sure you check out the podcast, which comes out, new episodes come out every Wednesday. And this week we're having a gentleman on who is an expert in teaching like financial literacy to children. And so he talks about what can we do as parents to set our kids up for success when it comes to teaching them about money and finances. Super interested in that because I knew nothing about it. And then also making sure to tap into our Facebook group that I was telling you about. It's already, it's only been going for a week or two. We've already got over 250 members, and it's a really great group of parents who are super supportive and positive. So I really encourage you to be part of that too. And then send us an email, drterryegan@gmail.com, and let us know what parenting topics that you want to cover. It can really be anything. And I'll do my best to answer your questions. So thanks so much for being part of it today.